small that you can do on a daily basis that would incrementally improve you, that would lead to an expanding transformation of your productive ability and your ability to function in the world across time. You have your own nature, and it's best to work with it rather than against it. You don't want to just win, you want to get better while you play, right? So you want to find a partner who's as good as you, or maybe even slightly better. And then that puts you on the edge, right? Edge of what? Edge of the development of your perceptions, your attention, and your action. So you become a more skilled player. If you're disagreeable and self-centered, you can learn to do well for others by practice. If you're too agreeable and you sacrifice to others, you can dispense with your resentment and learn to stand up for yourself. These are things that everybody needs to know, and they're not only of abstract intellectual interest, they're extraordinarily practical. You need to know about personality to hire people properly and to place them and to promote them, and to do the same with yourself. It helps you understand your children better. It helps you understand your wife better. We deal with personalities all the time. We are personalities. You'll walk through dream analysis with Freud and analysis of religious mythology with Carl Jung and analysis of the dark tetrad personality types. You'll learn about communicating with others, negotiating with others, and developing your own personality, for better or for worse. So, why personality and its transformations? Well, because people are something, and they're also becoming something. And so if you want to understand personality, you have to understand it as a state and as a transformative process. And of those two, probably the transformative process is most relevant, because the transformative process is essentially equivalent to consciousness. And there's nothing that's more emblematic of what a human being is than the process of consciousness. So personality and its transformations, state and process. Why a clinical introduction? Well, some people who teach personality are also social psychologists, and a smaller minority are clinical psychologists, and I'm a clinical psychologist, and so I got interested in personality through clinical psychology rather than the reverse. So I'm interested in understanding personality as it pertains to mental health, or even flourishing, you might say, as opposed to psychopathology and the hell that accompanies mental illness. And so that's the rationale for the clinical approach. So, and that means that what we'll cover in some ways is more theoretical than might be the case for people who are trained more purely empirically or from the social perspective. I'm very interested in the philosophical approaches to religious and philosophical approaches to personality, as well as the scientific approaches, and I think they're reconcilable. So one of the experiences you might have if you train as a clinical psychologist is going to be, depending on the school that you attend, is that the psychoanalytic types, who are increasingly rare, are set against the behaviorist and more physiological types, or vice versa. The behaviorists are set against the psychoanalysts, but from my perspective, they're just viewing the same set of phenomena from different perspectives. And one of the things that I'm going to help you appreciate is the hierarchical nature of personality, the fact that it can be analyzed at multiple levels, that there's some apparent internal contradiction depending on where you start, depending at what level at which you approach the problem, but that those contradictions are more apparent than real. So I'll endeavor to provide you with something approximating a coherent and complete description of personality, lacking in detail as all forms of knowledge are, but one that will allow you to reconcile the findings of the more empirical biologists, let's say, and behaviorists, with the more abstract psychoanalytic thinkers and the phenomenologists. I believe that all those levels of analysis have their utility, and to the degree that they're correct, they're not going to be fundamentally disunited, assuming that there's something coherent about both personality and the approaches to personality. And there is something coherent. It took me a long time in teaching and thinking to start to understand not only how the theories differed, the multiple theories that we'll discuss, but what was the same about them, which is, I suppose, equivalent to something like the core of personality theory. And that's very, very exciting thing to understand, because everything that you'll learn in this course, I will endeavor to make directly personally relevant to you. It shouldn't ever devolve into a collection of dead facts. This is something you always want to do if you're lecturing in a manner that is actually compelling. The material has to be accurate, so let's say factually accurate, but it also has to be relevant to the people who are listening, because otherwise their attention will wander and they won't remember, and you'll bore yourself and your audience, and that's never a sign that you're on the right track, let's say. All right, so what are we going to cover? 7 different domains in an introductory manner, because this is an introductory course. We're going to talk first about religious and mythological conceptualizations of personality and its transformations. I like to set the more recent, let's say, psychoanalytic traditions and everything that stemmed forward from that, including the behavioral traditions, in a much more broad historical context. I think that's necessary, partly because you don't want to suffer from the delusion that everything about human beings that's relevant and accurate has been discovered in the last 150 years, which is most definitely and absolutely not the case. The scientific understanding of personality and the clinical understanding of personality have a deep affinity with markedly traditional understandings of the nature of human beings, stemming all the way back, as we'll see, to the shamanic conceptualizations, which are in all likelihood hundreds of thousands of years old.
What's it called?
Peterson Academy.
Peterson Academy.
Peterson Academy.
It's called Peterson Academy.
Peterson Academy. If you want an actual education.
With hand-selected professors from top universities around the world.
Bringing the best professors together, making sure they're not censored in any way, giving them the audience and the remuneration and appreciation they deserve.
And you were true to your word. You gave me absolute intellectual autonomy. I have had it through every course.
We figure we can offer people a high-quality university-level education for under $2,000.
Well, congratulations, Jordan. It's honestly brilliant. Can't wait to enroll myself. I'll be doing that straight after this.
Fun, Joe.
Pretty badass.
Yeah. Modern human beings in our current genetic form emerged about 350,000 years ago. We can assume some continuity of conception and process over that entire period of time. And that's also something extremely interesting to know, as setting yourself in a historical context that's that archaic gives you a much more fundamental sense of who you are and where you came from. And it's also the case that understanding those extremely archaic ideas, which also tend to be very fundamental and unchanging, sheds substantive light on many of the things that you'll experience in the modern world, most particularly the meaning of the narratives, the fictional representations, the movies and dramas that grip your imagination and entertain you. There's a reason that a fictional representation is entertaining when it's of high quality. And the reason is that it echoes in your soul, so to speak, at a very, very deep level. And one of the things that you'll come to understand more deeply, I hope, in consequence of this course, is why that echoing occurs. Then we'll talk about the psychoanalytic tradition. Now, the more strictly scientific types tend to be skeptical of the analytic tradition. And that's a big mistake. It's partly because the scientific enterprise actually has a number of stages, let's say, and one stage is scientific hypothesis testing and data analysis, careful experimental analysis. The behaviorist types, who are pretty physically grounded, were very good at that end of the scientific enterprise, as were the psychometricians, who concentrated on the measurement of personality. But the psychoanalysts we're exceptionally good at generating hypotheses, and that's a more unexamined part of the scientific tradition. Where do ideas come from? How do you generate an idea that's innovative and interesting? And the Freud and Jung, let's say, and their associates and followers were unbelievably innovative in their approach to conceptualizations of the human mind. And I would also say that recent developments, especially with regards to large language models and artificial intelligence, have demonstrated, I believe, conclusively that the psychoanalysts were exactly on the right track in relationship to the structure of the human unconscious. And we'll go into that in some detail. And that's something very new. I've only been able to understand that relationship in the last 2 years, let's say, because the large language models have really only been on the scene for that length of time. So I think large language model cognition can help us understand what the psychoanalysts technically meant by symbol. You know, one of the reasons the behaviorists, who are more down to earth, let's say, have criticized the psychoanalysts, literary critics for that matter, is their claim that the interpretations laid out by people like Freud and Jung were nothing but projections of the imagination. They bore no relationship to reality, no demonstrable relationship to reality, but the large language model calculations are predicated on the idea in a way that every word or every idea is surrounded by a cloud of ideas that are highly likely to co-occur together statistically, right? So you could imagine that the word witch, for example, is quite likely to be accompanied by words like cauldron or coven, and very unlikely to be surrounded by words like skyscraper or stainless steel. And so that a given concept exists within a cloud of associated conceptions, and the elaboration of that cloud of associated conceptualizations is something like the symbolic analysis, the free association symbolic analysis of the psychoanalysts, and also of the symbolic investigation of the literary critics. I suspect we're on the cusp in the realm of artificial intelligence of mathematically systematizing our assessment of symbolic representations. I already have a large language model built that's predicated on my work that's very good at dream analysis. And so that means to me, and I think this will happen, that the analysis of dream images will become something that can be purely scientific and mathematically encapsulated. So, and I really believe the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, were on the right track conceptually and practically with regards to the investigation of the symbolic meaning of dreams and literature, for that matter, drama. So that's extremely exciting. The idea that we can make not only a science, but even a mathematical model of the symbolic landscape that we inhabit. So we'll delve into that in some detail. Carl Rogers and the humanists. The humanist tradition is, I think it's a secularization of Christianity, essentially. Carl Rogers himself was a missionary before he lost his religious faith, and his representation of human personality in psychotherapy, because Rogers was very involved in the psychotherapeutic tradition, is a recasting of the Christian idea of redemption into the realm of secular mental health and psychopathology. Rogers believed that truth-seeking in the psychotherapeutic process was intrinsically redemptive, which is a restatement, you might say, of the gospel notion that the truth will set you free. We'll delve into Rogers, analyzing in particular his conception of dialogue as transformative, and do our best to understand what that means practically, let's say, with regard to your relationship with yourself, but also to other people, and also what it means in relationship to the genesis of psychopathology and its cure. Existentialism and phenomenology. The existentialists, the Freudians, let's say, the Freudians made the essential presumption that the that trauma was the cause of much psychopathology, that the default human personality was healthy, but when it suffered damage, especially early in life, the healthy developmental path was circumvented and various forms of pathology emerged. The existentialists questioned that particular Freudian presumption, making the case instead, which is also a case grounded in deep religious tradition, that the vagaries of human existence are such that suffering capable of generating psychopathology is not necessarily a consequence of trauma, but built into the structure of human existence itself, not least because we're self-conscious, say, and aware of our own mortality, which is a existential problem of sufficient magnitude to give us all grounds for a certain degree of mental illness and perhaps even malevolence in the absence of any particular marked trauma, which is not to say that some people don't have it worse than others, or that you won't have it worse at some times in your life than others, and you will. It's not to say as well that the consequences of having it worse might not have some additional influence, let's say, on the course of the development of your personality. I really like the existentialist approach because I think that the notion that what would you say, mental health problems, so to speak, the problem of psychopathology is not a consequence of the deviation of the normative or ideal human pathway, but something that's baked into the structure of human existence itself, that we all have to grapple with the finitude of our existence, let's say, and our subjugation to suffering, and that understanding that, how that warps and dements us, and also how that might be dealt with in a forthright manner, is of great utility. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who's not precisely a personality theorist in the classical sense, although is definitely an existentialist, made the case that the lies attendant on the human proclivity to deny the existential reality of our own experience not only warped our souls in the most profound of ways, but also laid the groundwork for the development of the terrible, atrocity-seeking totalitarian states that most particularly characterized the 20th century. And so the other great contribution of the existential theorists, as far as I'm concerned, is their ability to link the inadequacy of any given individual's approach to the existential problems of their own life with the emergence of something like state-sponsored hell on earth. And I think that that's something of absolutely crucial significance to understand. There's probably, one of the cliches that emerged in the aftermath of the Holocaust in World War II or prior to World War II, prior to and during World War II, was the notion that we should never forget what happened. But you can't remember something you don't understand, and it's not particularly easy to derive the lesson from Auschwitz. Now, the existentialists, and again, I would say particularly Solzhenitsyn, went further, and Viktor Frankl went further along that path than anyone else, trying to draw a relationship between your individual moral obligations, your failure to live up to them, and the genesis of the authoritarian catastrophes that characterized the secular 20th century. The phenomenologists I find particularly interesting because they, following Heidegger, approach the problem of what constitutes reality in a very unique manner. The more scientifically oriented Enlightenment behaviorist types and the psychometricians make the assumption that the most appropriate way to conceptualize reality, the truest way of conceptualizing reality, is in relationship to its objective truth. Now, there's some problems with that presumption in that our experience of reality, which in some complex way is indistinguishable from reality itself, has an irreducibly subjective element, which the objective tradition has a very difficult time dealing with. The phenomenologists attempted to circumvent that subjective-objective dichotomy by describing reality itself as that which is experienced. And adopting that approach, well, first of all, profoundly transforms the manner in which you think about what constitutes the real if you assume consciously or implicitly that only the objective is real. You cast your own emotions, motivational states, and dreams, fantasies, visions of the future, even the meaning of your life, into something that constitutes some second-order reality or even a non-reality, and that has potentially devastating, that contributes in a potentially devastating way to the development of a kind of life-devouring nihilism. If you're nothing but a brief flicker of flame, composed of dust on a third-rate planet at the edge of a minor galaxy, it's very easy to become cynical and dismissive about the fact of existence itself and your own life, and reconstituting your idea of what constitutes reality on the assumption that what you experience is the most foundational, is the fundament and the foundation, transfigures the manner in which you might conceptualize the dignity and significance of your own existence. And that's crucial existentially, because if you have contempt for yourself, as a second-order reality, let's say, it's very easy for that to become contempt for other people and even contempt for existence itself. And that's a very dangerous road to walk down, and one whose nature has been laid out quite comprehensively in the religious and mythological representations of man and woman that we already discussed, and in the psychoanalytic and existential traditions. So the analysis of the phenomenological approach, which puts human experience at the center of things, or maybe even experience itself, or maybe even conscious experience itself, is a powerful antidote to that dehumanizing objectivism, let's say. And Heidegger himself formulated his philosophy upon which the phenomenological approach was predicated in order to combat that dehumanization, and then paradoxically fell prey to the Nazi ideology and, say, degenerated into a supporter of precisely the kind of psychopathological approach that he, in principle, was attempting to fight. So, ironic twist in 20th century history. The Piagetian tradition, Jean Piaget, developmental psychologist, not often regarded as a personality theorist, but that's generally because personality theorists don't know how to integrate his thinking into the personality tradition. And I think I know how to do that, and so that's not a problem. I like Piagetian thought a lot, not least because it points, and he knew this, to something approximating an emergent morality that has a certain grounding in the objective. So Piaget noted, and we'll delve into this in some detail, that the games that children spontaneously play have a particular pattern. So part of that pattern would be, if I force you to play, that's not a game, and I'm not going to be a popular child, and you're going to be a bitter and resentful kid in consequence of the force and compulsion that's being applied to you. A game, a true game, has to be voluntary, has to have rules that both parties accept and are willing to abide by. There's a pattern, you might say, to games that have that quality and that can be played sustainably, or that can be played in an improving manner. And you might say the essence of the set of all playable games that can be played in an improvable manner is the foundation of morality. Is a very important thing to understand. You see that importance of that make itself manifest in the stages of childhood where children start to become truly social, which starts to emerge around the age of 3, when they can begin to take the perspective of someone else, when they begin to have true friends, when they can engage in reciprocally altruistic behavior, when they can take turns and share, right, which is to begin to learn how to treat another person as if they had the same status and importance as themselves or their own desires. That capability, well developed, makes them highly socialized, popular, and happy children, and also turns them into the kinds of adults who can engage in sustainable and improving patterns of cooperative and competitive behavior with other people, which is a good way, for example, of conceptualizing a friendship or a marriage. It's a game that can iterate, repeat, it has a certain pattern, and the iteration produces improvement as it progresses. Now, you can imagine that there's many ways of interacting with people that do not have that property. And a small subset, a straight and narrow path, you might say, that characterizes the set of interactions that do have that property. And if the goal is voluntarily sustained improvement of function, socially distributed, that's not much difference than the establishment of a transcendent ethic, the transcendent ethic upon which morality itself might be predicated. And so that's a very useful and interesting thing to understand. You know, it's a great antidote to the idiot moral relativism that proclaims that all approaches to social interaction are diverse first in their essence and also of equivalent value, because there's no transcendent ethic, no possibility of a transcendent ethic. I think that's mostly just an escape from fundamental responsibility rather than an intelligent approach. But I also think that the Piagetian analysis of the emergence of games in children, which you could dismiss if you were casual in your thinking as something relatively trivial. Why be interested in the games that children play before they're mature? His analysis of what children are doing is so profound that it points the way to the reconciliation between the religious viewpoint and the scientific viewpoint, which was actually what Piaget was trying to do. That was his motivation. And so that's really something to understand as well. I also like the Piagetian tradition because it builds it allows for the comprehension of personality from the bottom up, so to speak. Piaget was interested, for example, in what he called the basic reflexes that children bring into that infants bring into the world when they're born, the micro movements and